I paid for my parents to go on a luxury trip. After they left, I canceled all the reservations. I had treated my parents to a lavish trip to Europe, planning every detail. When I picked them up to take them to the airport, they informed me that they had elected to travel with my jobless sister instead of me. My mother grinned. Your sister needed some rest, so we decided to take her. I didn't say anything. When they arrived in Europe, they were in for a great surprise. "You're late," my mother exclaimed, stepping out onto the porch and lugging her bag behind her. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. "It's 6:02 a.m., Mom," I replied, attempting a grin. I got out of the car to help with the baggage, but then I noticed my sister Lauren emerge from the house carrying her own suitcase. My smile froze. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. My mother turned to me, her face way too happy for the circumstances. "Oh, Violet, we decided Lauren should come instead of you. She's been so stressed lately, and she really needs this trip." My chest tightened. "Instead of me, Mom, I've been planning this for years. I paid for everything." She waved her hand dismissively, as if I had simply brought up something unimportant. "We're grateful, sweetheart, but you're always working so hard. You can take another trip later. Lauren needs this right now." Lauren didn't even have the decency to look guilty. She only smirked and shifted her weight to one hip. "Thanks for understanding, sis," she murmured, her voice dripping with phony sincerity. I looked at the two of them, my heart racing. My father walked out a bit later, avoiding eye contact and handing me his suitcase. "This is unbelievable," I exclaimed, my voice shaking. "This was supposed to be our trip, something for me to share with you." "Well, it still is," my mother replied with a smile. "Just with Lauren instead. Don't make this a big deal, Violet. Your sister really needs a break. My name is V, and I'd been working extra hours for the past 2 years to provide my parents with an unforgettable vacation flights, luxury hotels, guided tours. I meticulously organized every detail down to the last dinner reservation. But as I stood in my parents' driveway, it didn't matter how hard I tried, Lauren was always number one in their eyes. I clenched my jaw, biting back the angry retort that was on the tip of my tongue. Instead, I forced a stiff smile before opening the trunk. "Let's get going then," I murmured, my voice flat. If they wanted to prioritize her over me, that was okay. They could accompany her, but I wasn't about to let them enjoy it. Except for Lauren's constant chatter, the drive to the airport was eerily quiet. "Oh my gosh, Mom, did you see that TikTok about Paris? I can't wait to go shopping there. Do you think we'll have time for that?" My hands tightened over the steering wheel as I stared straight ahead, forcing myself not to say anything. My mother giggled quietly. "Of course, we'll have time. We'll figure it out when we get there." When we get there, they didn't appear to notice that I wasn't part of that we anymore. At one point, my father cleared his throat. "Thank you for driving us, Violet. I know this probably feels unusual." "Unusual? That's an interesting way to put it, Dad," I replied. He didn't respond. He simply shifted uncomfortably in his seat, maybe wishing he hadn't spoken at all. Lauren leaned forward from the back seat, her words harsh. "You're not mad, right? I mean, this is really big of you letting me go. I could never have afforded this on my own." I clenched my mouth and forced a tight smile. "Of course, Lauren, enjoy the trip." By the time we arrived at the airport drop-off zone, my patience had worn thin. My mom hugged me as I helped them unload their luggage. "Thank you for understanding, dear." I nodded stiffly. "Sure, Mom." Lauren smiled as she wheeled her bag to the entrance. "Thanks, Violet, you're the best." I stood there watching them disappear into the terminal, my chest tight with anger and hurt. The ride back home was a blur, and I replayed the conversation in my head over and over, each word cutting deeper than the last. "This means a lot to Lauren. You're not mad, right?" I parked in my driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Then, without a second thought, I marched into the house, pulled out my laptop. Hotel reservations were canceled. Tours were refunded. Airline upgrades were denied. When I closed my laptop, a sense of satisfaction settled over me. They could explain themselves to the front desk staff in Paris, and I was done being their doormat. The tightness in my chest began to ease as I stared at the confirmation emails piling up in my inbox. If they wanted to take Lauren instead of me, that was fine. But they would not be staying in five-star hotels or taking private tours on my dime. The calls began as soon as their flight landed. As I unpacked my suitcase, the one I'd packed so meticulously for a trip, I groaned, picking up the phone and glancing at the screen. My mother's name flashed along with multiple missed calls and texts. I unlocked the phone and read through the messages. "Violet, what's going on? The hotel won't let us check in. The reservation is missing. Call me right away." "Violet, this isn't humorous. Fix it now." I couldn't stop myself from laughing. Did they really expect me to sweep in and save the day after what they had done? The phone rang again. This time it was Lauren, and I let it ring until she left a voicemail. "Violet, this is so petty," she said, her voice dripping with entitlement. "We're stuck here because of you. You must contact the hotel immediately and resolve the issue." I rolled my eyes and deleted the voicemail without listening to the rest. I'd been their fixer for years, smoothing over every mistake and picking up the slack, but not anymore. I eventually decided to respond, if only to stop the torrent of calls. My mother's voice hit me like a tidal wave of hatred as soon as I picked up. "Violet, what have you done? The hotel claims the reservation was canceled, and none of the trips are scheduled anymore." I let her yell for a bit before calmly responding. "I canceled them." After a long, startled silence, she yelled, "Why would you do that?" "Oh, I don't know," I responded, my tone tinged with sarcasm. "Maybe because you chose to accompany Lauren on my trip." "You're lucky I drove you to the airport," I added, voice rising. "We thought you'd understand." "Understand what?" I inquired, my voice now sharp. Those years of saving and preparing were irrelevant because Lauren needed a break. Did you think my efforts were in vain? Guess what, Mom, I don't understand, and I don't want to. I hung up before she could react and switched off my phone, tossing it on the couch. The calm that followed was beautiful, and I felt like I could breathe again. If they wanted to prioritize Lauren, fine. But they could work out the rest of the journey without me. The calm lasted barely a day, and the next morning my phone was buzzing again with calls and messages, which I initially ignored. I spent the day cleaning the house and catching up on work, but curiosity got the best of me, and by the evening I opened my phone, bracing myself for the storm of texts from my mother. "Violet, you've gone too far. Your sister is in tears. Your father is upset, and we can't get into any of the hotels you booked. Lauren, you're acting like a child. I don't see why you're making this such a huge issue. Just repair it already." Finally, from my father, I set the phone down, shaking my head. For years, I'd been the one to fix things, to make sure everyone was comfortable and happy. And now they didn't know what to do. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table, letting the anger simmer. How dare they expect me to clean up their mess? How dare they act as if I were the one in the wrong? The next call arrived minutes later, and this time I answered. "Violet," my mother said before I could respond, "this isn't amusing anymore. We are stranded. Do you know how embarrassing this is?" I took a leisurely sip of tea. "Embarrassing? Do you think this is embarrassing? Try saving for years, organizing every detail, and then being told you aren't even going on the trip you paid for." "Stop being dramatic," she said. "Lauren needed this more than you. And now she can figure it out," I stated firmly. "You've made your decision, Mom. You wanted to take Lauren instead of me. That's great. But don't expect me to pay for her vacation." "We're family," she said. "We don't do this to each other." I let out a bitter laugh. Funny, I was just thinking the same thing. Lauren's voice rang out in the background, crying, "Mom, just hang up on her, she's being impossible." That was the last straw. "Enjoy your trip," I said, my tone frigid. "Oh, you can't, because it isn't your trip." I hung up before she could respond and turned off my phone for the rest of the evening. I felt an odd mix of anger and relief, angry that they'd put me in this situation, but relieved that I'd finally stood up for myself. The following few days were blissfully quiet with my phone turned off. I finally had space to think clearly, free of the barrage of guilt trips and accusations. I spent my mornings sipping coffee on my back porch, enjoying the calm I'd craved for so long. My afternoons were filled with work and catching up on little projects I'd been putting off, things that reminded me how capable I was when I wasn't bogged down by their endless demands. But on the third day, curiosity got the better of me, and I turned on my phone to find over a dozen voicemails waiting for me. The first few were from my mother. "Violet, you should call me back right now. This has gone too far. I cannot believe you are doing this. You've embarrassed us. We are your parents. How could you treat us like this?" Then followed Lauren's messages, full of the same entitled tone she'd always used. "This is so petty. Even for you, you are wrecking everything. Just fix it, Violet." Finally, my father's voice, lower but no less pointed. "Violet, I don't understand what's happened to you. Call us back so we can work this out." I paused before listening to my mother's final voicemail, which was lengthy and filled with frustration and exhaustion. "Violet," she said, "we're back at the airport now. The trip is destroyed, and I hope you're satisfied with yourself. Your sister is upset, and your father and I are beyond disappointed. Call us when you're ready to speak." I deleted the voicemails without responding because I wasn't prepared to talk, and I honestly didn't know if I ever would be. This wasn't a one-time error, it was the sum of years of them putting Lauren first and expecting me to accept it with a smile. As the hours passed, I reflected on all the times I'd been overlooked or dismissed, every holiday where Lauren's whims dictated the plans, every family gathering where my accomplishments were treated as afterthoughts. This trip had been the tipping point, but the cracks had been forming for years. Grace arrived abruptly that evening, carrying 2 cups of coffee and an evident air of inquiry. "I heard about what happened," she said, placing the coffee on the table. "Your mom called me yesterday." "Of course she did," I muttered. My mother was always adept at enlisting sympathizers to coerce me into obedience. "I told her you were probably busy and would get back to her when you were ready," Grace said, sneaky smile forming on her face. I laughed and shook my head. "You're the best." "No," she replied, her tone becoming more serious. "You're the best because you finally stood up for yourself. I understand how difficult that is, Violet. Don't let them drag you back down." Her words stayed with me long after she departed. Grace was right. I'd spent far too long bending over backwards to please people who didn't seem to care about my efforts. It was time to halt that cycle once and for all. By the weekend, I had a strange sense of clarity. The anger was still simmering beneath the surface, but it was joined by something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. Freedom from their endless expectations. Freedom from being the family's fixer. Freedom to finally live on my own terms. But as expected, the silence didn't last long. It was Sunday afternoon when I received a phone call from my father, which I decided to answer. "Violet," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "your mother wanted me to call. She believes you'll listen to me." "Go on," I murmured, reclining back in my chair. He sighed. "Look, things have gotten out of hand. Your mother is outraged. Lauren is enraged, and everything is simply a mess. But you're better than this." I stiffened. His words elicited a new wave of rage. "Better than what, Dad? Stand up for myself. I refuse to let you walk all over me again." "That's not what I meant," he answered hurriedly. "It's just that you've always been the sensible one, the one who keeps everything together. This is not like you." I let out a short, bitter laugh. "You're correct. I'm not leaning over backwards to clean up your mess, which is unusual for me." He hesitated, and I thought he might finally understand my point of view. But then he replied, "You're punishing the entire family for one decision. Is that actually fair?" "Fair," I repeated, my voice rising. "You want to talk about fairness. Was it fair that you and Mom thought I wasn't significant enough to join the trip I had planned? Was it right that you replaced me with Lauren if I didn't matter?" "That's not what we were trying to do," he added defensively. "We just thought Lauren needed it more," he continued. "Of course you did," I yelled. "You always believe she requires more attention, more support, more of everything. And I am always asked to make sacrifices for her, not anymore." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. He eventually muttered, "I don't know what you want me to say." "I don't need you to say anything," I said, my voice firm. "I just need you to understand that I'm tired of being an afterthought. From now on, I'll come first. Goodbye, Dad." I ended the call and set the phone down, my hands trembling. For the rest of the day I allowed myself to feel everything: anger, sadness, relief. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the beginning of something new. I wasn't the family's fixer anymore, and I wasn't going to be. They could figure out how to clean up their own messes. When my parents and Lauren returned, I was waiting for them in their driveway. "Violet," my mother started, stepping out of the cab with an air of defeat. "I just wanted to apologize." "Save it," I said, cutting her off. "You made your choice, and now it's mine to deal with." And for the first time in my life I didn't feel guilty. The weeks that followed that phone call were quiet, too quiet in a way. It was as if the universe had decided I had endured enough, and now I needed the space to breathe, to think, and most importantly to rebuild. But rebuilding after years of living for others, smoothing over their messes, always differing to their needs, wasn't something that could be done overnight. I had learned the hard way that walking away from that family dynamic wasn't just about making a single decision. It was an unraveling of everything I thought I knew about my role in my family, my place in their lives. And it didn't come without its own painful reminders, each one reminding me of how deeply they had shaped me. The days turned into weeks, and I spent my mornings in the solitude I'd craved for so long. I'd sit by the window with a cup of coffee, staring out at the world I'd been too busy to notice before. There were flowers in the garden I hadn't planted, probably the work of Grace, whose quiet kindness had been like a balm to my bruised soul. She was the first to check in on me, not asking questions, not probing, just offering comfort in a way that felt genuine. She was, after all, the only person who really understood the weight of what I'd done. I remember the first day I truly smiled again. It wasn't because of something external, it wasn't because someone had apologized or my parents had come to their senses. No, it was because I had realized something. Something small but huge for me. I could take back my life. I no longer had to keep the pieces of me together for everyone else. I didn't have to answer every call or clean up every disaster, and I could stop pretending that my efforts had no value. I was free, and for the first time that freedom didn't feel terrifying. It felt like a weight lifting off my chest. Grace called me that evening, catching me in one of my rare moments of peace. "You still haven't seen them, have you?" she asked softly. I thought about the weeks that had passed since the trip debacle. I'd gotten calls, texts, even a couple of messages from friends who had heard through the grapevine about the mess at the airport. But I hadn't answered any of them. My mom had tried calling at least 5 times, and I'd blocked her number. Lauren's voicemail had come through, filled with her usual frustration. My father's attempts were less frequent, but still present, like a slow drip of unresolved tension. "No," I said, my voice quiet. "I haven't. I don't think I'm ready." Grace's voice was understanding but firm. "You are never going to be ready, Violet, but at some point you're going to have to make peace with the fact that they'll keep trying to call. They won't leave you alone." I sighed, leaning back against the kitchen counter. It was a wet night. The sky outside was a mix of deep purple and orange as the sun began to set. For a fleeting moment I imagined it was just me, no calls, no pressure, no expectations. "I know," I said. "I just I don't know if I'm ready to face them, to hear them tell me everything is fine, or that I've overreacted. They won't say that, at least not if they've been thinking about it long enough." I hadn't given them much time to think. I had withdrawn so quickly from their lives that it was like I'd vanished from the picture entirely. They hadn't had time to process my decision, and now they were in the middle of their own messes without me to step in. "I'll think about it," I said, though I didn't know if that was the truth. In reality, I wasn't sure I could face them at all. Not yet. The next week I was sitting in a coffee shop when I saw the message flash across my phone screen. It was from my mother. "Violet, I know we've had our differences, but this silence is doing no one any good. I think it's time we talk." I stared at the message for what felt like forever. That familiar sense of guilt crept up my spine, but it was different this time. Instead of collapsing under the weight of it, I felt something new, a small flicker of relief. Maybe it was time. Maybe the silence had gone on long enough. Or maybe I was just tired of living in limbo. I put my phone down and thought about it, weighing the options in my mind like I was standing at a fork in the road. I could keep hiding, letting the distance grow between us until we were strangers. Or I could finally have the conversation I'd been avoiding. The conversation where I told them how much they'd hurt me, how much I'd sacrificed for them, and how, after all of it, I still felt like I wasn't enough. A part of me wondered what would happen if I told them everything, all the years of hurt and resentment, the small and big things they never saw or never cared to see. But then another part of me asked, would it matter? I tapped out a reply, "Fine, let's talk." The following Sunday I met my parents at the cafe near my house, the place where we had first started meeting for casual weekend catch-ups before everything had gotten complicated. They were already sitting at a corner table, looking slightly awkward, as though they had no idea what to say or how to start. For once they looked uncertain. It felt strange seeing them in this state. My parents were always the ones with the answers, always in control. And now here they were waiting for me to lead the way. It felt, and maybe that was exactly what I needed. I sat down across from them, but I didn't speak immediately. I let the silence linger for a moment, forcing them to confront the awkwardness between us. Finally, my mother broke the silence. "Violet," she began, her voice soft, "I don't know where to start. I know we've hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. I never meant to make you feel second place. I never meant for it to be like this." Her words were the kind of apology I had been waiting for, but they weren't enough to undo years of neglect and misunderstanding. Still, they were a start. And for the first time I felt like I could breathe again. My father nodded along with her, but it was clear he wasn't the one who had been doing the thinking. It was my mother who finally saw the cracks in their perfect fade. "I've been thinking a lot," my father said slowly, "and I know we both made mistakes. I see now how much you've done for us, and I didn't appreciate it the way I should have. I didn't respond right away." I let their words hang in the air, testing the waters, seeing if they meant them. But what I didn't expect was for Lauren to walk into the cuff, her presence feeling like a heavy weight. "Violet," she said, her voice stiff, but not quite as combative as it usually was. "I've been thinking too. I want to apologize. I didn't realize how much I took for granted." I looked at her, my sister who had always been the favored one, the one who never seemed to understand what it was like to be overlooked, to constantly be expected to play the part of the responsible one. For a moment I was speechless. "Lauren," I said finally, my voice low, "you've always gotten what you wanted without thinking about anyone else, but you don't get to just apologize and fix everything with words." Her face flushed, and for once I didn't feel sorry for her. I felt empowered. "I'm not here to fix anything," she said softly, almost in a whisper. I'm here to tell you I've been wrong, and I want to change. I know it's going to take time, but I hope you can forgive me." The words hung in the air heavy with the weight of everything that had come before them. I wanted to tell her how angry I still was, how much it hurt that I had been left out in favor of her. But in that moment I realized something. Forgiveness was a gift I could give to myself, not to them. I let out a slow breath, looking at all of them. They were here, finally acknowledging everything I had been through. But even if they couldn't fix the past, they could try to change the future. "I'll think about it," I said softly, my gaze meeting each of theirs. And that was the beginning. The months that followed that day at the Cove were quiet, but in a way that felt like the beginning of something new, not the end of something old. The apologies from my parents and Lauren had cracked the facade. We didn't immediately become one big happy family again, and I didn't expect that. Healing was slow, measured in small moments rather than grand gestures. My father, who had always been emotionally distant, started making an effort to check in on me, asking how my work was going, how I was feeling, things he had never cared enough to ask before. My mother, too, began to respect the boundaries I had set, even if it felt awkward at first. There was no more demanding that I drop everything to be there for them when they needed something. Lauren and I, well, we didn't exactly become the best of friends overnight, but we started talking more slowly. I still carried the weight of all those years of being overlooked and pushed aside, but she was trying in her own way, and that for the first time made me believe that change was possible. I was still me, still the daughter who had been hurt, but I was different. I wasn't waiting to be fixed by their apologies. Instead, I had started the work of fixing myself. I took on new projects at work, ones that stretched me in ways I hadn't dared before. I spent weekends with Grace, sometimes just sitting in silence, other times laughing over coffee or making plans for the future. It was simple, unpursued, exactly what I needed. But the most important change was how I had come to see myself. I stopped defining my worth. For the first time, I thought about what I wanted, what I needed, and I started giving that to myself. I reconnected with old friends who had slipped out of my life in the chaos, and I found joy in the little things, the mornings with coffee, the books I had always wanted to read, but never made time for, the quiet moments when I didn't have to be anything other than myself. One evening, about 6 months after that first conversation, I found myself sitting at the same cup with my parents. It wasn't a confrontation anymore. It was just a meal, something we had done when I was younger, before everything became so complicated. Lauren joined us too, and it was strange but nice to not feel the weight of old resentments hanging over us. There was an unspoken understanding that things would never be perfect, but that didn't mean they couldn't be good. I took a breath, looking around at the table. I had made my peace, not just with them, but with myself. I knew I would never be the daughter they wanted me to be, the one who sacrificed herself without question, without complaint. But I was okay with that, and they were learning to be okay with it too. The conversation flowed easily that evening, filled with small jokes and questions about the future. It was nothing monumental, no grand reconciliations or deep emotional breakthroughs, but it was enough. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't waiting for something to change. I wasn't holding my breath, and when the evening ended, I didn't feel the urge to rush home or hide away. Instead, I felt a quiet, deep contentment, the kind that comes from knowing that you've finally stepped into your own life on your own terms. I wasn't the person I had been when I walked into that cafe months ago. I was someone new, someone who was learning to live for herself. And for the first time, I knew that the story I was writing for myself was my own, and I was the only one who could end it. But there was no need to rush. Life was unfolding one day at a time, and that was enough.